Hi, folks. It's the middle of the afternoon here in Indiana. I'm recording a couple of these today, but it's thunderstorming. So if the power goes out or something happens, you might get a two-part recording. I wanted to say, to give you a little hint, this is now about a third of the way through the book. And people are going to ask, well, what is this used for? Well, anytime you're a boss, anytime you're a manager, you might be looking for change, how to make the organization work better. These theories are about that change. I'll tell you a quick story. My MPA students, which are the master's students for the program after this public sector management, I have a group of all public, they're nonprofit groups, so they serve publics. Those folks are doing their thesis, and they have to have a theory in there, and every one of them have chosen theories from org theory. Now that sounds strange, but that's the way you use this, not only academically, but you use it, as I mentioned a minute ago, practically. Now, some of you may not see that yet, but I promise you, if you go on to a master's thesis, you will use these theories in a lot of classes. Right now, we need to get you kind of familiar with them. This isn't a graduate book. This is an undergraduate book. Graduate books probably are a little more intense. I don't teach the graduate org theory class. Anyway, I hope that I should say I don't teach it any longer. I hope that you'll take that as a lesson, that this material is useful in your work life, but also if you decide to go on to grad school, you may want to keep this book to help you. What we're talking about is used every day by good managers to change their circumstances, to change how they deal with workers, to get more productivity, to help themselves look better and get promotions. That should be a clue to you. All right, so let's take a look at the first chapter that we're going to record today. And that is going to be chapter 4. I'm going to launch it. It's about autonomy and control in an organization. Okay? So, control is most simply defined as alignment among organizational participants. Everybody rowing at the same time is the old adage. But there are different ways to achieve that. Rules, coercion, commitment to the organization. How do you get people to do it in the best way? Coercion's probably not your best choice. Rules, more bureaucracy. Commitment, more relational based. In the bureaucratic organizational form, controls are achieved through hierarchy and formal rules. You do have a sense of autonomy, but within those silos are your functional roles. This autonomy enables proactive behaviors. So helping the customers, making sure that they are served. Autonomy helps some other ways. It creates blaming, territorialism, withholding work effort. Those are all strategies that workers use when they are faced with a lack of autonomy or they don't like the autonomy that they are given. Now, this is a theory that I'm familiar with because it came out of studies of policing. It argues that frontline workers have a realm of autonomy within bureaucratic organizations. Police agencies are militaristic organizations, very formal bureaucracies. They got lots of rules and so on. But out on the street, an officer needs some autonomy to deal with situations. So it's known as street-level bureaucracy. It also has been written about for groups like social workers, preachers. Lots of different people have used this kind of idea. So it's within the confines, their autonomy is within the confines of the job, but it might be limited by their concept of the broader picture. In the relational organizational form, okay, control should be the coordination of functions, the coordination of collective self-control. Supervisors have to really have discussions about the goals and the best way to achieve those goals. And those discussions are not top-down. They're not one way. They have to be reciprocal, relational form. It's called shared or distributed leadership. So if you're looking up, you may see those terms in some of these articles. Now, there are some alternative perspectives on control. You remember I said last chapter that we have kind of the one polar opposite, which is pure bureaucracy, and one which is pure coordination or interaction. But there are some things in between. So these are some of those alternatives in between, and you're going to see those in the writings we look at. The rationalist perspective, work is about disunity, must align incentives and monitor to avoid shirking. You know this. There are people that don't do their fair share, maybe even in your agencies. So this perspective may give you an idea as a manager how you would manage that unruly employee, the one that doesn't want to do their fair share of the work. Of course, there's conflict perspective using neo-Marxists or the new Marxists. Kind of Marxism was developed 150 years ago, but the world has changed it's almost 170 years ago. And as the world's changed, as we've moved from an industrial economy to an informational society, things change. So the bureaucracy nowadays, or an organization, is to divide and conquer, divides workers to prevent them from collaborating, and it really kind of sacrifices something in that process. This conflict theory really has a conflict between the organization and the workers, and some of our workplaces represent that, some don't. Leadership, then, is a form of social influence. It can be directive and autocratic, okay? And we've all had bosses like that. Do it as I say and do it now. But it can also be empowering. It can inspire people. There's different labels for democratic leadership: democratic, participatory, transformational, distributed, shared. Look for those here. They're really talking about this empowering kind of leadership. Okay, so Frederick Taylor, The Fundamentals of Scientific Management. This is a classic study in organizational theory. And Frederick Taylor talked about the interests of the workers and managers must be aligned. Worker autonomy is not a positive thing. People can get together and withhold their work ethic. In other words, they don't work as hard as they could because they're mad, because they're overworked, because they're underappreciated, lots of things. He called this soldiering. Soldiering is enabled by a false perception that conflict of interest exists between the workers and management. Workers' lack of knowledge about how to best accomplish the work, and managers' lack of knowledge about how best to accomplish the work. Now, Taylor was into this scientific management, literally holding a stopwatch and watching people and trying to figure out what were ways to get the most out of the human animal in this case, line production. So how can we get more widgets made by the same people in less time? How can we maximize profits? So that's really the scientific management. The approach to the work process: managers need to know the work and tell workers what to do. Okay, talk about autocratic, talk about bureaucratic, talk about top down. The more managers have knowledge of how to accomplish work, it will prevent that soldiering. So typically these organizations bring managers from the bottom up because they have that knowledge, and they look for the people with the personality that is trying to get the most out of everybody's work effort. Now here's Mary Follett again. As you can tell, there she is, the basis of authority. Now, she says that authority should not be vested in a hierarchy. It's not top down. Authority should be based on knowledge from each position. Everybody who works has knowledge that's useful for the organization, she would say. This worker knowledge is about how things are done, how their work connects to the whole. Now, if they're just focused in their little silo, they will never know how it affects another part of the organization. So your knowledge of your job and the larger work processes fosters authority and responsibility in your workforce. I don't know why that won't go away. McGregor, very famous theoretician, Theory Y, the integration of individual and organizational goals. So there's these group of theories, theory X, theory Y, there's even a theory Z somewhere along the way. But McGregor was talking about the difference between somebody else's theory called theory X and his theory Y. So theory X is the dominant theory of human behavior, assumes work is a utility, shirking is to be expected, job management is to elicit work effort from reconcile reluctant workers. Gee. So that's the bureaucratic model. But he says that theory Y assumes work can be self-rewarding. Have you ever noticed somebody that they're just happy at work all the time? And they just find really a pleasure in helping others and doing their job. They're that, 90% of the time they're in good spirits. Managers to provide the conditions that enable work and intrinsically motivate their people. To enact this, you rely on integration and self-control rather than external direction and control. So he's arguing against bureaucracy. He recognized both the organization and the worker needs are legitimate. Okoye, toward an economic model of the Japanese firm. Now remember, a lot of the management theories in the 80s came out of Japan. Japan was an economic powerhouse. Their way of doing business was so different from, let's say, Western democracies like the US or in Europe, that people were studying them, trying to figure out how they got so much effort from their employees. And in some cases, those corporations showed up, those organizations showed up in America, and they found the workers to be very different. So they were trying to figure out how what they did in Japan could be modified to work in the United States. So basically, Okoye talks about the trade-offs between vertical control and horizontal coordination. You can get vertical control, but it needs to be consistent with this, sideways. Japanese firms tend to be less hierarchical in work process and placing an emphasis on horizontal. They achieve control instead through an incentive system. So here we start to see really important incentivization of work. In addition, the organizational goals may need to be adjusted to respond to the employee voice. So now they're listening to the employees and they're making adjustments. That way they create this joint venture or partnership between management and employees. BAT talked about work organizations, technology, and performance in customer service and sales. Now, a lot of us in the public sector do not like to think of ourselves as customer service or sales, but in reality, we are. We have clients that come in and we try to help them. So the Department of Public Social Services in LA County, they are looking to help people figure out what needs they have, where they can get help, and bring resources to it. So here, BAT looked at Tayloristic, that goes back to Frederick Taylor's, looked at Taylor's work practice and how to combine it with participatory, high involvement work practices. So a hybrid from Taylor's more bureaucratic model to something that's a little more towards the involvement area. Assessments of performance outcomes associated with different ways of organizing work. This really talks a lot about our employee satisfaction, our employee assessments that we might do yearly. Some places do them quarterly. Most public agencies, I think yearly would be a good metric for them. Assessment is a research method-based task. Can you see the applicability of your research methods course now? You had to take a research methods course. And you're going to see it because people use theory and methods as the backbone of making these kinds of articles. And it's also the way you do business these days. You don't just go, I have a good idea. You have to use data to drive that idea. You have to have proof. And I used the word metrics a little while ago. Perhaps many of you have seen those in your organization and didn't think of metrics as a research method. It is. Lipman-Blumen, connective leadership, female leadership styles in the 21st century workplace. Again, throughout this book, you're going to see this idea that women maybe lead organizations in a different way. Maybe it's more collaborative than the old dominant bureaucratic type. So leaders can exercise relational control by seeking to build connections among others based on common goals. That's not a uniquely gendered thing, but it seems like with Follett being the theorist and other researchers, they have developed, they've carved out this niche that female forward theory and female forward ideas are worthy for these organizations to consider in getting more work from their workers. So leadership connects individuals to other and others' goals. Networks of relationship bind us together, both within our social groups and as a society. Connective leadership comes more naturally to women because of their socialization. Now, I sometimes get students that go, well, that's just not true. I would like you to think about how we as men have a leadership style and how women have a leadership style. And you might see, yes, I'm sure you can find an exception, but in general, these kinds of generalizations do apply. They are a different way of thinking, and they are worth considering. Sweeney, Thompson, and Blanton, trust and influence in combat and interdependence model. Now we're talking a high-stress, potentially lethal work environment, combat. So you got to have trust in your leadership. It just has to be. Mutual trust between leaders and subordinates enables the achievement of goals. Now, they're talking about a specific high-stress area, but could that apply to other situations? Yeah. What if we had another earthquake in Los Angeles and our Department of Public Services is strongly challenged because of the collapse of bridges and gas lines leaking and water pipes breaking and so on? If we have a hierarchy, we could scale up and address those issues. This is saying that trust between the leaders, when the leaders say, we've got to go fix that first, and then that, and then that, trust in that leadership would help, even if the bureaucracy is challenged by the circumstances. So the subordinates have trust in their leaders and perceptions of their credibility. Trust is influenced by relational factors, personal factors, and organizational factors. So this is saying that in a bureaucracy, things function because people are human. They're not just kind of like robots following rules and regulations. Okay, that's a pretty good summation of this chapter. Yes, these are quick, but I keep throwing ideas at you of how to think of these. I would watch these first and then read. It may help you. Have a good afternoon.